may have heard about in the mid-1980s in the Graham-Redmond-Hollings process, which was named after these three senators who came up with this idea. Senator Redmond said it's a bad idea whose time has come. So that gives you sort of a feel for it. And it essentially said if we set a target for the deficit, then by setting that target for the deficit, we will make people do things in order to achieve that target. And it was a really simple idea, which is the deficit's $200 billion. We're going to set a target for the deficit that's $40 billion less every year until, after 5 years, it will be zero. And so they started with a $200 billion deficit. In the year in which it was supposed to be zero, the deficit was $255 billion. So just picture this. They went from a $200 billion deficit to a $255 billion deficit in 5 years. And so my conclusion from that, and I'm going out on a limb here, was that it didn't work. And but there are still people out there, and Senator Graham is a key economic advisor to the McCain campaign, who say we should just bring this back. And I say not. I mean, I say there are other things that we could do. There's a line item veto for the president, and that's usually sort of tied to earmarks. President Clinton had a version of the line item veto for 1 year that was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. The versions of the line item veto that are being debated now are weaker than that version, because that version sort of didn't pass constitutional muster. So the odds that anything really big is going to happen as a result of that are not all that substantial. Limiting earmarks, President Bush said, for example, that he would veto any appropriation bill that included more than half the earmarks that were in the appropriation bill from the year before. And so I suppose some president could decide to do that or do that kind of thing. But again, that's not really where most of the money is, and that's not really where most of the fiscal problem is. And then there's the perennial biennial budgeting, which is sort of can be summarized as, I hate doing this sort of ugly process every year, so wouldn't it be better if we did it every other year? And I think it wouldn't cause a lot of harm, but I think it also won't have much of a positive effect. And I actually left CBO at about the moment when I had been forced to write my 4th or 5th testimony on biennial budgeting because I just couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't stand having to sort of rehash the same arguments over and over again in response to somebody who thought that this was the one and only reform that would make a difference. Okay, and then finally we have management reform. The Bush administration inherited this law called the Government Performance and Results Act. How many people in here have heard of the Government Performance and Results Act? All right, that's good. The Government Performance and Results Act was passed in 1993, and its idea was that federal agencies should engage in strategic planning, performance measurement, performance reporting, and that ultimately there should be more of a connection between expenditures on the one hand and the performance implications of those expenditures. And so the Bush administration has been very active in this area. They implemented something called the Program Assessment Rating Tool, where they took 1,000 programs in the federal budget and evaluated them in terms of their performance. They created something called the President's Management Agenda, which were 5 cross-cutting issues that they thought were the biggest issues that were facing the federal agencies in terms of management. And so there's a lot of groundwork that has been laid for a new administration. And I don't think there's any particular reason to expect that a new administration is necessarily going to reverse these trends. But here's sort of what these trends tell us so far. That there's been a substantial increase in the production and use of performance information in the executive branch, which has been met with some combination of apathy and hostility in the Congress. That is, the Congress has not shown any particular desire to substantially change the way they normally do business, which I would call, if you can call this budgeting by results, I would call what the Congress does budgeting by input. And budgeting by input means I'm focused on where the money's going geographically. I'm not necessarily focused on what good it's doing, with the possible exception of the good that it's doing in terms of helping me get reelected, which of course is is one form of good.